I think that comparison is inadequate because we're experiencing something new today, which is anti-Zionist Jews who align themselves with our enemies are doing so in the name of Jewish values, Jewish history, and they say we are the ones who are upholding authentic Jewish identity. You Zionists are betraying the Jewish story. And we haven't quite figured out yet how to deal with that. And it requires a different set of tools than simply relying on the old accusations of self-hating Jews. It's something different going on. It's no less dangerous, maybe even more dangerous, precisely because it's coming from within us.
Hi, and welcome to the Z3 Podcast. I'm Amitai Fraiman, the director of the Z3 Project, and this is our podcast. In today's episode, I have the great honor of sitting in conversation with award-winning journalist and author Yossi Klein Halevi, who's also a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. It was a very timely conversation. You know, Yossi came from Israel, and it was very interesting to hear his perspective about the situation both in Israel and his perspective of what's going on here in North America as he travels the country, meeting with students and communities in this post-October 7 moment and in the war that we find ourselves. And it was particularly interesting to hear the trajectory of his, the story of his self-understanding of his own identity and the Jewish communal landscape, and what are some of the pitfalls we need to think about both here and in Israel in terms of the polar opposites where we can be pulled in this moment, and what are some questions or conceptual frameworks we need to think about as we try to emerge from this moment of great angst for our communities, and how do we think about the relationship and the nature of the relationship, and what can we do to continue to nurture it, and what can we learn from each other perhaps, and how can we foster better understanding. So I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I do. Please follow us on our various platforms. We're on Instagram, on X, on LinkedIn and Facebook, TikTok, and please check out our website, z3project.org, where you can also join our newsletter. And please, I welcome you and hope you enjoy this episode with Yossi Klein Halevi on the Z3 Podcast. Take a listen. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
It's great to be with you, Amitai.
It's a real honor, real zchut. You are, I'm not going to say all your praises in front of you. It's not best practice. Flattery only would get me so far. But I think that, we find ourselves in an interesting moment. And, the purpose of the podcast, part of what we're trying to achieve is to expand some of the conversations we have at our conference year round and have an opportunity to dig deeper with leading thinkers in the field of Jewish communal life here and in Israel. And we are in a moment. Yet again, the Jewish people find themselves in a historic moment, and I think we have a real opportunity to hear your experiences. Being in Israel in this moment, what you're seeing there, what you're seeing here, and I'm very eager and excited to hear how this conversation goes.
Well, it's great to be with you, and I really respect the work that you're doing. Our friend David Chazoni, and it's really kol hakavod to you guys.
So, yeah, thank you. So it's great to have you as a partner in this. So I think we often start, just for the sake of our audiences, for the off chance that they don't know who Yossi Klein Halevi is. Maybe just like briefly, very briefly, how you landed where you are today.
Well, I grew up in a survivor home in Brooklyn, old Brooklyn before it was cool, and in a neighborhood that was not cool then and is still not cool, Borough Park. Borough Park is the definition of anti-cool. And that shaped my life to this day. My father raised me with the consciousness of service to the Jewish people, of the sense of, on the one hand, the privilege and responsibility of being part of the Jewish story, and on the other hand, very much with the Holocaust survivors, angle on this question of Jewish identity. You don't have a choice, so you might as well just be a Jew and embrace it. And I think he was right about many things. He was actually wrong about that. And understandably, for his generation, it was inconceivable that, with everything that they had experienced, to imagine that a time would come, not in the not too distant future from after the war, that Jews would actually be able to choose whether they wanted to remain Jewish or not. And so I grew up with this feeling that I had no choice to be Jewish. And my process of owning the Jewish story for myself was realizing that I'm not my father's contemporary, even as a surrogate contemporary. And he really raised me to try to see myself as a kind of surrogate survivor and to see the world through his eyes. And my process of maturation was to break with his experience and own my own Jewish experience. As an American born, I mean, it was Borough Park, so it was tangentially America, but nevertheless formally America. And living at an amazing moment of living between the freest Jewish community, freest diaspora in Jewish history, and a sovereign Jewish state. This, I grew up in the most blessed generation of Jews, I think, in history. My father grew up in the most cursed generation of Jews in history. And it was realizing the tremendous gap between his experience and mine, which was so vast that it's astonishing to me that it was measured only in decades and not centuries. And so owning my own life story, my own generation's experience, was really part of becoming a Jew on my own terms, very much still carrying my father and what I learned from him, but trying to bring it into my own experience.
Yeah. So that realization, when do you recall when you started noticing it, that distinction between the two?
I think that for me, the real turning point was going to journalism school. I went to Northwestern, and that was my first encounter with America. Until then, I went to Yeshiva University for a year. I went to Brooklyn College. I went to Hebrew University. These were all safe Jewish spaces. Yeah. And then I went to grad school at Northwestern, which until a few years earlier had still maintained Jewish quotas.
Wow.
And my graduating class in journalism school was probably 40% Jewish. But almost none of our professors were Jewish, which I think is really telling. Today, I would imagine, half the journalism faculty is Jewish. I don't know if it will be that way in another generation. But my experience at Northwestern was realizing that I could be a Jew in America and be publicly Jewish. And it was okay. And it negated everything that my father really raised me with. Now, the irony here, there's a postscript. I was at Northwestern last week. I'm on a campus tour now. And I met with, before I did a campus talk, I met with Jewish students at Hillel. And I asked them, what's it like here? And I told them something of my experience, how Northwestern is so important for me because that's the place where I realized that I'm living in a totally different Jewish reality. And what I heard from them about Jewish life on campus was so depressing and happening at that place that I love and that was so important for my own growth. Jewish students feel under siege, as they do in so many other liberal campuses. And there's this growing tendency, which they described, to self-segregate. In other words, the Jewish Jews on campus don't feel comfortable in general spaces anymore. And for me, it wasn't a shock. Obviously, I've been following what's going on, but it was a kind of a profoundly disorienting moment to experience that at the place where I had learned that I could be fully comfortable as a Jew in America. And I think that what's so shocking for American Jews about what's happening on campuses is that it's happening at the very place where American Jews first experienced unconditional acceptance. And now the unconditionality of that acceptance is being rescinded. So I don't know if I've given you more than you bargained for.
No, that's,
But that's really what's on my mind now, especially
yeah.
after this visit to my alma mater.
So what I'm curious to hear about then, if, you set it up in a very neat, kind of tidy way, right, of like an arc of the Jewish story in America almost. And recently there was that piece, about the end of the golden era of American Jewry. And I'm curious if your sense as someone who's grown up here, spent the majority, or many years in Israel.
But a majority of my life by now. I'm 70 and I've been living in Israel for 40 plus years. So.
Yeah. So, and looking at that, do you think that this is or do you worry that this is indeed the beginning of the end?
I don't think it's the beginning of the end. It's certainly the end of what the last few generations have experienced, that sense, again, of unconditional acceptance. And this is the great crime that the anti-Zionist left has committed against American Jewry, is that it has restored conditionality to Jewish acceptance. We, the progressive anti-Zionist left, we'll accept Jews. We're not anti-Semitic, but you have to conform. You have to sign on the dotted line. And what was so liberating for my generation, and then the next couple of generations especially, my generation was kind of a transitional generation between marginality and full acceptance. But the sense of you can be any kind of Jew you want. You can be Chabad lighting the Chanukiah in a public space. You can be a country club Jew. It didn't matter. You could certainly be a Zionist. And America would accept you. And now that's being rescinded. So, but I don't see that, to say that it's the end of the golden age is different than saying it's the end of American Jewry. American Jews are going to have to learn to live in a new psychic space, as are Israelis, which is that we're not victims anymore, but we are vulnerable. And we have power. We have no right to consider ourselves victims. We don't want to be victims. And the whole trajectory of the post-Holocaust Jewish renewal was the negation of Jewish victimhood. That's the two flags on the bima. That's what they symbolize. Right. The empowerment of the Jewish people in different ways. In America, soft power. In Israel, hard power. But we all realized after the Shoah, the whole Jewish people, just about, realized that powerlessness had become untenable. And so we rejected victimhood, we assumed power, and the identity of victim is not an option for us. But we are, once again, vulnerable. And that's a really uncomfortable place to be in, is to have power and vulnerability at the same time.
Yeah, it's difficult to hold those two at the same time.
Really difficult.
Very difficult. Yeah, and I'm curious as you're speaking, because something I've come to appreciate over the years is that even though within the Jewish community we talk about a lot of our issues as, we may not say it explicitly, we think of them as uniquely Jewish, right? For example, the decline in affiliation with central institutions. Well, we know that in America in general, the category of nuns is the biggest one, regardless of your...
You mean N-O-N-E-S?
Yes. The nuns, the nun-affiliated. Yes, exactly. Yes. And so, do you think that perhaps, and I don't know, this is as you're speaking about the condition, the need to have a condition. Is that actually something that's true? That every group there's a condition to their participation in the American story, and we, for a while, were given a pass to that?
It's a great story, a great question, because like many Jews, I'm so self-referential. Yeah. I don't, then you say, oh, wait a minute, it's a really good question. Yeah. I think that the promise of America, whether it was always fulfilled or not is another question, but the goal of America was to create a path into Americanness that was unconditional for everyone.
Right.
Now, obviously, it hasn't played out that way for all kinds of groups.
Right.
But for those who were admitted into Americanness, I think that you could pretty much write your own identity ticket.
Yeah.
And with Jews, it really came late. It happened 1960s, 70s. And I think there were lots of reasons for it. I think Israel contributed a lot to the empowerment, the psychological empowerment of American Jews on both ends of the dynamic. First of all, it gave American Jews a feeling of psychological safety and pride. And Americans generally loved Israel. Paul Newman, Ari Ben Canaan was an American hero, not just a Jewish hero. And the Six-Day War reinforced that. And what's so painful now is how we're seeing an opposite dynamic, is that Israel, which made my generation so proud and opened the pathway into American identity, today is playing a very different and much more complicated role.
Yeah, I want to pull on that thread in a minute, but I do want to go back for a second because just knowing a bit of your biography and also the arc of the books that you've written, right? So you described that when you went to university, that is when you recognized that you have this ability to be Jewish in a public square in a way that was, in a way that was unapologetic, maybe. My word, not your word, but at least.
No, that's right.
And yet, for some that may lead to a path of, therefore I don't need to rely on my Jewish identity anymore because I'm accepted. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it is my understanding that there was a moment where you went off and maybe doubled down on a more kind of particular element. And I'm being careful with my language, not to say things that are incorrect, but
Oh, go for it.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, you wrote a book about your memories, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not looking. And the two part of this question, and I'll let you know, and then but is how that happened, or why do you, if you're reflecting on it, and then today, because we're seeing also a lot of folks being radicalized,
right?
And kind of, do you see a connection?
Yeah, I mean, look, I grew up on the right and then the far right of the Jewish spectrum. My father did not intend for me to go to the far right, but I took his survivor instruction, his survivor manual, and translated it in my teenage way to radical right-wing politics. So I started in Beitar, which is the right-wing Zionist youth movement, Menachem Begin, Jabotinsky, and eventually found my way to Meir Kahane. Now, this was the late 1960s. So it wasn't quite the Kahane that we came to know in Israel. It wasn't the Kahane who focused on expelling the Palestinians and who really was an out-and-out racist. This was a Kahane who focused more on protecting vulnerable Jews, whether in what used to euphemistically be called changing neighborhoods in New York, or saving Soviet Jewry. And that was really the issue that I connected with Kahane on Soviet Jewry. And I had been very active in the Soviet Jewry movement as a teenager, and Kahane came along and said, well, the only way that we're going to get this issue on the front page is if we're ready to use violence. And when you're 17, you say, well, makes sense to me. And so I became part of his orbit. I was never part of his inner circle, but I was very much drawn to him. And so when I went to college, I could have never gone to Northwestern if I was still with Kahana. The break came before. And there were all kinds of reasons for that, including experiencing the new Kahana when I was a student in Israel. I went to Hebrew University for my 1 year abroad, my junior year abroad in 1973, the year of the Yom Kippur War, as it turned out. And that was the year that Kahana tried to break into Israeli politics, the first time that he ran for the Knesset, and he lost. And I went to volunteer, and I became part of his campaign. And I gradually realized that it's not quite the same Kahana in Israel that it was in New York. And so I broke with him, and just about everyone who had been with Kahana in New York broke with the Kahana of Jerusalem. So, and then, now the irony, though, about Northwestern is that at exactly the moment when I finally figured out how to be an American Jew is when I moved to Israel. but in a way, though, I think that progression makes a certain sense, because you can only leave America when you know what you're leaving. And I moved to Israel very much aware and appreciative of what I was leaving behind in a way that I would not have been when I was still in the Kahana mindset or in my father's worldview. And it was only when I realized what an amazing thing it is to be an American Jew that I said, well, it actually might even be more amazing to be an Israeli Jew. I still think that's true, and it's not a competition. I believe that both of these centers are unbelievable gifts to the Jewish people. And the fact that these two centers emerged more or less simultaneously, a self-confident American Jewry, and I hope it stays that way, and Jewish sovereignty, and both of these centers emerging after the Shoah, is one of the most extraordinary stories in Jewish history. To my mind, maybe the most extraordinary. Yeah. And so today I embrace both of these stories passionately, and I'm very glad with the personal choice I made of moving to Israel, but I see it very much as a personal choice. I would not preach Aliyah to American Jews. I think that's ridiculous, especially after October 7th. And that's without minimizing what's changing here. But I hope for a thriving American Jewry.
Yeah. So given what you've seen now, you're on this tour, on a college tour, and recognizing that there is a shift, an end of something. How do you, and I do want to soon go to what's going on in Israel and your experience there, but still while we're here and your observations about American Jewry, how do you think about, or what are things that the Jewish community needs to be cognizant and maybe shifting in their thinking, and realizing that there's a condition now to their participation. We're seeing people that have to cloister themselves off again in these spaces.
Look, this is a turning point for all of us. It's a turning point for Israel, turning point for American Jewry. And the choice that American Jews are facing is, do you wholeheartedly embrace your Jewish identity, partly as a kind of a dafka move, in your face, but obviously it will have to be deeper than that. It can start that way. That can be a very useful trigger for a return to Jewish identity, for a full Jewish identity. But it will need to deepen. So that's one option. Another option is to say, this Jewish stuff is just too toxic, and it's interfering with my ability to be accepted by my friends in the spaces, the progressive spaces where I live. And most young American Jews live in kind of quasi-progressive spaces. And what worries me is that we could be seeing a throwback to earlier generations of American Jews who saw Jewishness as an obstacle to being accepted in American society. And I certainly, the Jewish community that I grew up in, was at the tail end of that. But I remember it very well.
Yeah.
And I remember the Jewish establishment being very hesitant about a public Jewish display. And, so for example, it took the Jewish establishment a long time to fully embrace the Soviet Jewry protest movement. Jews don't quite do that. They don't quite go out into the streets in that way. And I'm worried that many young American Jews are going to see Jewishness as, once again, an obstacle. And we can only appreciate in retrospect what the golden age of American Jewry really was. That the Pew Report, I don't know, was it from 2016, around that time, showed an astonishing 94% of American Jews expressing pride in their Jewish identity. 94%. Whatever it was they're proud of, right. That Jews are funny, or tikkun olam, whatever it was. Yeah. And if you would have asked Jews of my generation, of American Jews, are you proud to be Jewish? I don't believe those numbers would have been anywhere near what that study showed. So I think that we're looking at a really delicate moment. And the Israel piece of this
that was going to be my next
is really complicated, because there is a tendency, you hear it. It isn't it isn't full-throated yet, but it's starting. And that is to blame Israel for the rise of anti-Semitism. Yeah. Israel is complicating the lives of American Jews. And that's a very dangerous road to go down.
And because I think that we're looking at, because up until this point when you raised Israel, you were you the way you said it was about the Jewish identity. But I think if you look at some of even the most progressive or anti-Zionists, they would say, we're fully committed as Jews.
Exactly.
It's not our Jewish identity. As Jews, we're accepted.
This is why the comparison that Sharansky made between anti-Zionist Jews of today and the Oldiev-Zektia, which was the anti-Zionist Jewish section of the Bolshevik Party. And I think that comparison is inadequate, because we're experiencing something new today, which is anti-Zionist Jews who align themselves with our enemies are doing so in the name of Jewish values, Jewish history, and they say we are the ones who are upholding authentic Jewish identity. You Zionists are betraying the Jewish story. And we haven't quite figured out yet how to deal with that. Yeah. And it requires a different set of tools than simply relying on the old accusations of self-hating Jews. It's something different going on. Yeah. It's no less dangerous, maybe even more dangerous, precisely because it's coming from within us. Yeah. But it requires really conceptually a different approach.
Yeah, I saw earlier on in this war, there was that claim that was made across social media of we are in line with traditional traditional movements within Judaism,
Right.
listing the original Reform movement and
Or the
even,
Bund,
or the Bund, yeah,
Right.
or Satmar,
Right.
and this I found, I try to
There's a
find
big
humor.
difference.
Exactly.
Big
So
difference.
Satmar HQ, their official Twitter was like, "Don't confuse our
Exactly.
theological anti-Zionism with your political one."
Yes, yes. And it's not only a question of theology. Satmar, unlike Neturei Karta,
Yeah.
Satmar would never align themselves with external enemies of the Jewish people. Neturei Karta goes to Iran,
Yeah.
meets with Hezbollah, and I think that there's a really interesting distinction to be made in terms of who is a part of us and who isn't, and that's the Satmar Neturei Karta test. If you've concluded that Zionism was a mistake, it shouldn't have happened, but you wouldn't align yourself with BDS, with those who are trying to criminalize Israel, and especially at a moment like this when we're feeling so vulnerable, you wouldn't kick us when we're down. Then you're in the Satmar school. I don't like it, but okay, that's your Jewish identity. But if you actively join with our enemies, you are Neturei Karta. And as far as I'm concerned, Neturei Karta and I are not part of the same people anymore. That's a very strong statement to make. But I really feel that. I would not be part of a minyan with Neturei Karta or with Jewish Voice for Peace.
Yeah.
They're not part of my Jewish world.
Yeah, I know it's a very painful thing to say. I think that we, in this moment, and we're often asked about, in the Z3 context, like who's in the tent, who's outside the tent, and we have to make these distinctions and parsing different things. But I think that for me, a moment of clarity after October 7th was like we could, up until October 7th, we can have this conversation about, anti-Zionism and, anti-Semitism. We can have a theoretical debate. I know where I stand on it. I imagine I know where you stand on it. But post October 7th, for me, that debate became entirely irrelevant to the point that what are we really talking about here? And I like that I find that model of like Satmar, the distinction between Satmar and Neturei Karta very helpful in that sense.
I largely agree with you, but I would just qualify. I would say not entirely irrelevant, the debate whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but largely irrelevant. And the reason I make that distinction is because the reason I make that distinction is that on the one hand, we're seeing that practically speaking, there's very little difference in how anti-Zionism plays out, which is, for me, I don't really care if anti-Zionism is technically anti-Semitism or not. In some ways, anti-Zionism is worse than a certain kind of anti-Semitism. I don't care if you don't like Jews, if you think Jews have big noses, Jews are cheap, or Jews are spendthrifts, or Jews are whatever it is. The old-fashioned kind of snobbish anti-Semitism. That's not a real threat to me. But to try to destroy my country, that's a real threat. That's much worse than kind of social anti-Semitism. There's a different kind of anti-Semitism, which is, and here I think anti-Zionism does fit the pattern. For me, the heart of anti-Semitism is turning the Jews into the Jew, into the symbol for whatever a society or a civilization regards as its worst qualities. Christ killer under Christianity, capitalist under Marxism, race polluter under Nazism, and now, in the era of international human rights and anti-racism, we are the ultimate white supremacists. And so there is a pattern there. But when I say that largely agree with you. We do have to leave open some leeway here for the exceptions. And so, for example, Jews who are anti-Zionist, I can't accuse them of anti-Semitism. It's another pathology at work, but it's not anti-Semitism. And I would also say, that Palestinians who are anti-Zionist, I don't like it, but we're in a war. And I understand why Palestinians resent Zionism, wish that we had never come back home, and oppose Zionism. I can't accuse them of being anti-Semites. Many are, but not necessarily.
But does that open the door on our side to allowing also conversations towards the Palestinians that we don't necessarily feel comfortable with?
Look, I think that something we touched on earlier, which is the question of the renewal of Jewish power. The renewal of Jewish power requires a different kind of conversation, also about anti-Semitism. To me, there's this old need that many Jews have to reclaim the purity of victimhood. There's a kind of nostalgia, and you see it especially on the anti-Zionist Jewish left. We were pure. Power and sovereignty have corrupted us. And to some extent, that's true, inevitably.
Yeah.
I look at Netanyahu, and I see the embodiment of the corruption of power. He's like one of these, he's out of the book of Malachim Bet, of one of these corrupt ancient kings of Israel, who always seemed like mythic figures until this government, and suddenly, wow, there they are. And so there is something sobering about the corruption of power. But so there's this need to define our enemies as anti-Semites, because before the reemergence of Jewish power, when we were totally powerless people, it was obvious that if you hated the Jews, you were completely evil, you were debased, you were anti-Semitic. If you accused the Jews of killing children, you were making a blood libel. Today, it's a little less clear. We have killed children. Now, we don't do it deliberately. That's where the blood libel comes in. But we're not entirely innocent anymore. And so even on the Jewish right, there's this longing for the condition of innocence. And what it means to be powerful is to own the identity of power. And that means, first of all, a moral responsibility. You are obliged to look at the consequences of your actions. Now, we're not used to being in this gray area of where, on the one hand, we're no longer innocent because we have power. And look what, we have devastated a large part of Gaza. I personally don't believe we had a choice, but we did it. And that has some consequences for power. One consequence is you can't call yourself a victim anymore. But on the other hand, much of the world is denouncing us as victimizers. And we're not victimizers either, because we're reacting the way any country would in our place. But we're in this really strange loop between the self-pity of victimhood, especially after October 7th, and the accusation of victimizer. And neither of those categories are useful for understanding Israel. So what we need to do now, again, is inhabit a very uncomfortable gray area. We're not used to it. For 2,000 years, we lived with the clarity of victimhood and oppression. And now suddenly, we're still being stigmatized, but we're not victimized. Even though on October 7th, we actually had a one-day relapse into victimhood.
Yeah. So it sounds, the way that resonates with me, and I like how you're allowing for the margins to have these conversations, because it also allows us to hold ourselves accountable.
Yeah.
And so, turning to what's going on in Israel, how in your experience, in your observation, how is this going to shift Israeli society? Because and just to make a finer point on the question, there's a story that we're telling ourselves and the story that we're telling the world. And we're not doing ourselves service by trying to hold on to that pure victim model.
Not at all. It also doesn't work anymore.
Right.
It worked for the first week or two
Right.
after October 7th.
What we're talking about, what we're really saying is that there's a process of maturation that Israel as a society needs to go through in seeing ourselves and looking in the mirror and saying, yes, there's a terrible war in Gaza. Yes, we decimated whole areas. We didn't have a choice, for those who hold that position. There's consequences.
I certainly hold that position.
But there's consequences. That's like, that's being an adult, right? Like you make decisions and there's a consequence. You're not going to forever, you're a child, then you're irresponsible, but now you're responsible for it. You have to live up to it. And so my question is, do you think that we're going to be able to do that as a society?
If we don't, then we are heading toward a very bad psychological place. Because what the far right, the Jewish far right, and the Jewish far left have in common is the perception or the need for the identity of victim. And each of them plays it out in a very different way. The far left plays it out by saying, well, we're victims. That's the essence of Jewish identity, is that we were victims, and therefore we have no right to power, because the glory of our identity is victimhood. And that's where we connect to other victim peoples, and so we betray the essence of our identity. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, etc. And the far right plays it out in the opposite way. They say, because we were victims and we're still victims, and the world hates us and the Goyim hate us and they always will hate us, therefore we have to use power without restraint. There are no limits to our right to power because we're victims. And that, of course, is very much a Palestinian mindset. And what we see in the American Jewish community is a growing tendency toward the far left centralization of victimhood in a rejection of power. And what we see in Israel increasingly is a far right rejection of the limits of power. And these, for me, the great internal danger, political danger in the Jewish people, is the growing temptation to reject power within the young American Jews, and the growing tendency to reject democratic norms and restraint among young Israelis.
I have some half a thought. It's totally half-baked. But I'm curious to hear your response to it. And to say that it's totally half-baked and irrelevant is also...
Half-baked means that it's that there's half merit to it.
The more I'm seeing this in other conversations as well, but like this idea of elevating victimhood feels very, very, very Christian in a way. And I wonder if there's truth to that claim, then what's the Jewish response to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and of course in classical Christianity, I mean, the paradox was that Christianity officially saw itself as a religion of martyrdom, and of course the crucified Messiah is the ultimate symbol of that, but really venerating a long tradition of martyrdom, and yet at the same time reveled in power. The church was the most powerful institution. And even more than that, the theological proof that Christians through the centuries, until our time, it's not true any longer for the most part, But Christians in the past would point to Jewish powerlessness and say, here, this is proof that God has rejected you. But wait a minute, you're the religion of victimhood. and yet in the polemics with medieval polemics against Jews, the absence of Jewish power was proof that God no longer loved the Jewish people, had rescinded the blessing. So I don't know what to make of that.
Yeah.
That's why and especially given the fact that the Catholic Church has repudiated that, theologically has repudiated that position, I wouldn't go in that Christian direction.
Yeah, because I guess what my curiosity is around, like, for this transformation of Israel, like, and we've said similar things in other points of this conversation, like we need a new framework, we need a new conceptual kind of approach to things. We can't look at it through this, the prism that led us to this moment. And I'm like wondering, because I don't know. We're very much in the ba'irua atzmo, right? We're in the event itself, of how do we think about Israeli society, Israeli, the politics there, and here as well, of course, of what are we going to learn about ourselves through this moment. And I don't know if we have the language for it so much.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Not yet.
Yeah.
We're still, certainly in Israel, it's still October 7th. Yeah. This is the first time I've been out of Israel since October 7th. And it's so disorienting. And it's only when you step out that you realize what it is that we're living through there. We are in a constant state of mourning. And it's so strange to be among people who aren't experiencing that. Right. Have you been back to Israel since?
Not yet. This summer, my brother's getting married, so we're going to...
Pshat tova.
Yeah, thank you.
So, it's just a totally different country. Yeah. And that's why it is premature for us to find the language. I mean, look at the music that's come out since October 7th. It is unlike any war music we've ever experienced in Israel. It's so much more raw and enraged and traumatic, and also much more religious than any war music we've ever experienced. Yeah. So in the second Intifada, toward the end, you already started. You began to have the beginnings of religious music in popular Israeli music, but here it's so overt. So it's so hard to know what language is going to come out of this. And again, just judging by the music, we can see certain directions. Right. Some of them intriguing and positive, others I'm afraid of. Yeah. So like that can be a reflection of, part of the greater shifts that we're seeing in Israeli society and the election kind of patterns, and what you just said about like the fear of going off towards that kind of approach. And we're winding down. We're getting towards the end of this. I thought we're just starting.
I mean, I feels that way, but I also know that you're on a long trip, Yossi, and I do appreciate our time with it. And I just as we're thinking towards the end of this, I'm being here, and working primarily with the American Jewish community, and what we're seeing there is a gap of the sense of urgency that Israelis feel. I grew up there. I served. I internalized a lot of it. For sure, our friends and family, serving right now. How do we continue to bridge that sense of urgency? Because here it's not only that the day-to-day, there's all the layers of why we don't feel it, mostly. But as you're saying, like it can push us towards this thing that Israel is the problem.
Right. Look, Amitai, I think that to some extent, and I'm sure your experience validates this, to some extent, it will be impossible to expect American Jews to share that sense of urgency that we feel over there. It's just not fair to expect it of American Jews. It's not really possible. What I'm hoping for is to at least for American Jews to understand that Israelis are experiencing a sense of urgency, and more than that this is a moment the likes of which Israelis have never experienced before. and to try to understand us. I don't think we can experience each other's Jewish realities, but we need to do a much better job trying to understand each other's realities. And I would begin in a very simple and obvious place, which is that Israelis and American Jews live in opposite circumstances. American Jews, even post-October 7th, still live in what is the most accepting country in history of its Jews. And as a result of that, American Jews have developed religious and communal and political approaches that are flexible, that are open to the general non-Jewish society. And that's the right strategy of adaptability to the unique circumstances that American Jews find themselves in. In Israel, we live in opposite circumstances. Look at our borders. We're surrounded by proxies or allies of Iran that want to destroy us on almost every border. And so our response is deterrence, which is the exact opposite of the American Jewish response to their circumstances. And that, too, is an essential expression of Jewish adaptability. And we need to begin by respecting the ways in which American Jews and Israeli Jews have adapted to their circumstances.
But, I think there's an angst around, a younger generation that is unable, unwilling, and trying to, be empathetic as well.
Yeah.
To accept the realities of Jewish power and what Israel needs to do in order to survive, quite literally. And I find that a challenging conversation, and with growing numbers. And I don't know, and there's a sense of loss around, like, there's people who are leaving, and I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what the community. I don't think the community knows what to do with that yet.
But do you also feel that people are coming in?
We're seeing that. We're seeing people leaning in, for sure. I think that part of and this is a deep concern. I grew up in the second Intifada in Israel, and I had a similar, much shorter stint.
My two older kids did too, and that was that trauma will never go away.
It'll never go away. It'll never go away. I just this Friday with that 14-year-old boy. I was in ninth grade, and I was friends with Kobe Mandel.
So was my son. From baseball camp.
Yeah. And
you too? You went to baseball camp?
We went to play baseball in Jerusalem, but Kobe through
Gezer?
No, not Gezer. I was in Jerusalem, but through before they moved to Tekoa, they were friends with we had close family friends, the Peskovs, or musicians and jazz musicians.
I know.
So Chaim and I grew up together. Whatever. It's the whole the Jerusalem geography piece. Right. But that that brought up to me. But the point that we've seen, you've spoken about this in the past, how like that was a moment, a moment of transition for Israeli society and pushed in a certain direction. My concern is that this moment will do something similar in Israel and in here. And that's, when I was asking about your time, and your exposure to Kahana, about extremism, like I am, the discourse is polarizing, not only in Israel, like in America, right? And in Israel as well. And like, that's, my fear is that we are going to, that we're going to double down on our own positions. And so to your question of like those who are leaning in, they're coming, unfortunately, some of them from not a sophisticated enough place, and so they're going to be the loudest voices who are saying the things that we, right? So, and I don't know how to, just the beginning of thinking about this stuff.
We're in such uncharted waters right now. The one interesting thing that I felt after October 7th in terms of the American-Jewish-Israeli relationship was that this was the first time in the history of the relationship where both American Jews and Israelis felt vulnerable, each in different ways. And that's not enough to build a relationship, a deep and lasting relationship, but it was the beginning of what I hope will be a reset in the relationship.
So Yossi, we're near our end of our time. If there's anything, a parting thought that we haven't covered, or like a takeaway that you think our audience should really be meditating on as we end this conversation.
expanding a little bit on the question of the future of the American-Jewish-Israeli relationship, which, by the way, we often use the term diaspora Israel, but it's misleading because aside from American Jewry, the rest of the diaspora is very much aligned psychologically, emotionally with Israel, overwhelmingly so.
Yes.
It's only American Jewry where you have a growing alienation from Israel and even the reemergence of Jewish anti-Zionism. And that's a very interesting question about why is American Jewry unique? And I think it tells us something about the uniqueness of the American Jewish experience, that sense of acceptance here, and what will happen as that sense of acceptance begins to erode as it is. But how do we do better in this relationship? How do we take advantage of this moment so that rather than this intensifying the process of mutual distancing, we can really begin a different kind of conversation? And for me, a starting point needs to be mutual respect. Now, Israelis never really respected the diaspora generally, and American Jewry in particular. And this is an extraordinary Jewish community. It has a lot of problems, has a lot of flaws, but there's a creativity here that American Jews didn't appreciate. For example, religious Jewish feminism, which really began here in this country, or the tremendous process of conversion to Judaism. I don't know if we've ever had this in Jewish history, certainly not since the Roman era when you had some mass conversion. But this is an extraordinary moment, and I happen to be married to a convert, and this sense of, I know personally what converts give to Jews. I know what my wife, Sarah, has given to me as a Jew. And so there's something that Israelis have missed about the Jewish authenticity of American Jewry. And on the other side, more and more American Jews look at Israel, and maybe this was always the case, only through a political lens. You either support Israel politically, you oppose Israel politically. Israel is not just a political story. And I mean, I think one of the if I understand what Z3 hopes to do, is really to broaden and deepen the connection. There needs to be cultural exchanges, religious interaction, a spiritual component to our relationship. And so I see this potentially as an extraordinary moment to do a deep reset in the relationship. And I think you guys at Z3 are positioned to step in at exactly the right moment with the right vision. So I'm very grateful to you.
Well, grateful for you, Yossi. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really
pleasure.
Appreciated it, and I look forward to continuing this. Reading more of your works and exchange of ideas and following all the wonderful things that you are doing.
Thanks.
To kind of further the conversation.
I look forward to seeing how you guys develop. So.